The fork was already lifted. The room was full, 200 guests, crystal chandeliers, the kind of silence that only money can buy. And Kedrick Voss had one rule at events like this. He didn't pause. Not for whispers. Not for stares. Not for anyone who hadn't earned the right to slow him down. So when the child's voice cut across that silence, "Don't eat that, sir," he almost didn't stop. Almost. The fork froze an inch from his mouth. Not because he chose to listen. Because the voice cracked on the last word. Small. Raw. Like the kid was terrified of being ignored more than anything else in that room. Every head turned. 200 pairs of eyes landed on a boy, maybe 5 years old, dressed in a tiny black suit that was slightly too big for his shoulders. He had reached out one hand toward Kedrick's plate. Not touching, just reaching. His eyes were wide and wet and locked on the food like it had already done something wrong. Kedrick set the fork down. Slowly, his jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the child to the plate, and then, without expression, to the man standing 3 feet behind him. White suit, still posture, eyes that hadn't moved since Kedrick walked in. The man wasn't a guest. Kedrick knew every guest. He wasn't staff either. Staff didn't stand like that. Like they were carrying weight that had nothing to do with the room. Kedrick felt something shift in his chest. Something old. Something he had spent 4 years burying. "Why?" he said, voice flat and quiet. "Are you here?" The man in the white suit, Arinder Kane, didn't answer. Hi viewers. If a child you didn't know suddenly stopped you from eating at a public event, would you listen to him? Or would you walk away? Drop your answer in the comments. I really want to know. The room held its breath. Nobody moved. Not the guests. Not the staff. Not Serilith Bain, Kedrick's fiancée, who stood at the far end of the table in a perfectly pressed charcoal suit, watching the boy with an expression that wasn't fear. It was irritation, and Kedrick, without turning his head, caught it. He looked back at the plate, then at the child, who still hadn't lowered his hand. The boy's name was Niel, and he was staring at Kedrick like the answer to a question no one had asked yet. Kedrick didn't move right away. He sat very still, the way men do when something hits them before their brain catches up to it. Security reached for the boy. "Don't." One word from Kedrick. Quiet. Final. The guard stepped back. Niel lowered his hand slowly. He didn't run. Didn't cry. Just stood there, shoulders tight, watching Kedrick like he was waiting for something. Arinder stepped forward, not quickly, just a single step. Enough to place himself between the boy and the room. That detail landed. Kedrick saw it, filed it, said nothing. Instead, he picked up his glass of water, set it to the side, and looked at the plate again. Whatever was on it looked exactly like everything else on the table, same garnish, same plating, same careful arrangement. But the boy had looked at it like it was a weapon. A staff member was called. Quietly. No announcement. The plate disappeared. The room started murmuring low, careful whispers that moved through the crowd like a slow current. Serilith shifted slightly at the far end of the table. His smile returned. Smooth. Practiced. Too practiced. Arinder remained standing. He hadn't spoken. Hadn't been asked to. And yet he stayed, with Niel pressed close to his leg. The boy's fingers curled into the fabric of that white suit like he was anchoring himself. Kedrick watched that too. Something about Niel's eyes had been pulling at him since the moment the kid opened his mouth. He couldn't name it yet, but it was there, familiar in a way that didn't make sense. Testing it? Kedrick asked a nearby attendant. Yes, sir. Lab team is standing by. Good. He leaned back in his chair and finally, fully turned to face Arinder. For years since that name had been anything other than a closed door in the back of his mind. And now the man was standing in his event hall in a white suit with a child tucked against his leg. No explanation. No warning. Just there. "You haven't changed," Kedrick said. Arinder's jaw moved slightly. "Neither have you." It wasn't a compliment from either of them. The silence between them was thick, the kind that builds when two people have already had every version of a conversation without ever speaking it out loud. Years of unsaid things, compressed into a single room. Niel looked up at Arinder once, then back at Kedrick. The boy wasn't afraid of him. That was the part that didn't fit. Most children shrank under Kedrick's attention. This one just looked, curious, measuring, like he was trying to figure something out. The crowd was still watching. Kedrick didn't care about the crowd. He cared about the fact that the plate was gone, and nobody had explained yet why a child in a room full of powerful strangers had known to stop him before he ate it. The attendant stepped close and leaned in low. "Sir, the preliminary results are back." Kedrick didn't look away from Arinder, and the pause was just a second too long. The attendant leaned closer and lowered his voice to almost nothing. "We need to wait for full confirmation, sir." "But the initial screen—" He stopped. "Say it," Kedrick said. "It flagged positive." The table nearest to Kedrick went quiet first. Then the next one. Then the next, like a wave moving outward. Silence spreading through the room as people caught the shift in the air. Nobody knew exactly what had been said, but they felt it. That's how rooms like this work. Power moves fast. Fear moves faster. Serilith's expression didn't break. He kept that smile calm, even completely controlled. He picked up his own glass, swirled it once, and took a slow sip. Niel pressed closer to Arinder's leg. Arinder didn't react to the news. Not visibly. He stood with both hands loose at his sides, his eyes steady, like he had already known what the test would find. That stillness said everything. Kedrick stood up from his chair. The room responded immediately. People straightened, stepped back, gave space. He walked around the table without hurry and stopped in front of Arinder. Close enough to speak low. "How long have you known?" Arinder met his gaze. "Long enough. Long enough." Kedrick repeated it flat. "And you waited until I had the fork in my hand. You were never going to listen to me before that." That was true. And Kedrick hated that it was true. He looked down at Niel, who was staring back up at him with those wide, steady eyes. No panic. No performance. Just a child who had done what he came here to do, and was now waiting to see what happened next. Kedrick crouched down to the boy's level. "What's your name?" The boy blinked once. "Niel." "How did you know about the food?" "Niel?" Niel glanced up at Arinder, then back at Kedrick. He didn't answer. Kedrick straightened slowly. Full test results arrived 11 minutes later. The compound was identified, not a standard poison, not something that would act in minutes. A slow agent. The kind that builds quietly over weeks. The kind that looks like fatigue, then illness, then something worse by the time anyone thinks to look. The room erupted. Not loudly, this wasn't that kind of crowd. But the murmuring became movement, and the movement became something harder to contain. Phones came out. People stepped away from tables. 3 guests moved toward the exits. Kedrick didn't move. He stood in the center of it all and felt. Not shock. Not fear. Something quieter than both. He turned and looked across the room at Serilith. Serilith looked back, still smiling. Kedrick crossed the room like the crowd wasn't there. People stepped aside. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke to him. He walked the full length of the hall and came to a stop directly in front of Serilith, close enough that this conversation would stay between them. For now. You want to explain the plate? Kedrick asked. Serilith tilted his head slightly. Careful, Kedrick. You're about to make a scene. I'm going to give you one chance. One chance. Serilith smiled. Not nervous, not rattled, just considering. You've always been dramatic about ultimatums. The compound in that food takes weeks to work. Kedrick kept his voice level. It doesn't kill fast. It doesn't kill clean. It dims you, slowly, until you stop being a problem. Serilith said nothing. That's not random, Kedrick said. That's planned. Everything I do is planned. The smile didn't move. That's why you chose me. The room was watching. At this distance, nobody could hear the words, but they could read the posture. They could read the stillness of Serilith's expression. And they could read the way Kedrick's hands stayed completely still at his sides, which was always a worse sign than anger. Why? Kedrick asked. Serilith finally set his glass down on the nearest tray. He turned to face Kedrick fully. Unhurried, like this was a board meeting he had already won. Because in 6 months, Serilith said quietly, you would have signed over controlling interest to a joint account. And by the time you realized something was wrong with your health, every major holding would already have a second signature on it. He paused. I wasn't going to kill you, Kedrick. I was going to make you manageable. The word landed like a closed door. Kedrick studied him for a long moment. Then he said, would you rather be loved or survive? Serilith blinked. That was the first real crack. Just a flicker there and gone. That's what you asked me, Kedrick said. 3 months ago. You said it like it was a philosophy question. Serilith's jaw tightened. It was a plan. Kedrick stepped back. 1 step. Just enough space to make the next move clean. He turned away from Serilith completely and walked back across the room toward Arinder. His voice, when he reached him, was flat and stripped of everything else. You knew. Not a question. Arinder's expression didn't shift, but his shoulders moved just slightly, like something heavy had settled further down. You knew what was in that food, Kedrick said. You knew what he was doing, and you came here tonight with that child, and you waited. Niel stepped closer to Arinder. Not afraid, just close. Yes, Arinder said. 1 word. Kedrick looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not relief. Something older and harder to name. How long have you been watching? He asked. Arinder didn't answer, and that silence, that careful, deliberate silence, was somehow worse than anything Serilith had just confessed. The hall had mostly cleared. Security had moved Serilith to a side room. Quiet, no cameras, no announcement. That was how Kedrick handled things. No spectacle, no press moment, just removal, clean and complete. The guests who remained were standing in small clusters near the walls, voices low, watching the center of the room where Kedrick stood with Arinder and the boy. Nobody approached. For years, Kedrick said. He wasn't shouting. That was the thing about Kedrick Voss that people always got wrong. They expected volume. He delivered weight instead. 4 years, Arinder. No call. No word. You were just gone. Arinder held his gaze. I know. And then you walk in here tonight. With a child I've never seen. And you saved my life. And now you're standing there like you're waiting for me to thank you. I'm not waiting for anything from you. Then what are you here for? Arinder didn't answer immediately. He glanced down at Niel once, brief, almost involuntary, and that glance told Kedrick more than a full sentence would have. You always know, Kedrick said. You always know things before they happen. You always have a reason. And then you disappear before I can ask what it was. Kedrick, don't. His voice didn't rise. It just stopped the sentence. They stood close. Two people with 4 years of distance compressed into 3 feet of space. The chandeliers above them were still lit warm gold, completely indifferent. Niel looked up at Arinder's face, then back at Kedrick's. His small hand reached up and found the edge of Arinder's sleeve without looking. Not grabbing, just holding. Like a reflex. Kedrick saw it. He went very still. Who is the child? The question came out quieter than everything else. Not aggressive. Not cold. Just careful. Like he was already afraid of the answer. Arinder's chest rose once. He didn't speak. Niel looked at Kedrick with those wide, familiar eyes, and didn't look away. The silence stretched. And in that silence, something cracked open. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a slow, steady fracture running through everything Kedrick thought he understood about the last 4 years. Arinder. His name. One more time. And still, no answer. Arinder opened his mouth, then closed it. That was enough for Kedrick. He turned away. Not dramatically, not with anger. Just a slow pivot that said he was done waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. He walked 3 steps toward the window. Stopped. Stood there with his back to the room, staring out at the city lights below. The hall was quiet now. Down to maybe 30 people. The rest had cleared out during the commotion. The ones who stayed were staff, security, and the kind of guests who couldn't leave without looking like they had something to hide. Arinder watched Kedrick's back. Niel sat down on the edge of a chair nearby, small, patient, like he had done this before, like he knew how to wait out the silence between these two men. The poison wasn't random, Arinder said finally. Kedrick didn't turn around. I know that. There are people behind Serilith. People who needed you weakened before the fiscal quarter closes. The compound was chosen specifically because it mimics stress fatigue. By the time your doctors identified it, the asset transfers would have been finalized and irreversible. I know that too. Kedrick's voice was flat. What I don't know is how long you've been aware of it, and why you chose tonight. Pause. Why not a phone call, Arinder? Why not a message? Why not anything, at any point in the last 4 years? That wasn't silence. That landed. Arinder felt it land. He didn't deflect, didn't explain. He just stood with the weight of it because there was no clean way to carry that question. You don't get to come back, Kedrick said slowly, and control what I know, or when I know it, or how. I understand that. Do you? Kedrick turned now. Because understanding it and doing something different are 2 separate things. And you've only ever done one of them. The room held still. Niel looked at the floor. Arinder took 1 step forward, then stopped himself. I didn't leave to hurt you. He said it quietly, not as an excuse, not as a defense, just a fact that had been sitting inside him for 4 years with nowhere to go. Kedrick looked at him for a long moment. Then why? Arinder's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, and that specific silence was somehow the most painful thing in the room. Here's what Kedrick didn't know. 4 years ago, 3 days before Arinder disappeared, a man came to his apartment at 2 in the morning. No name, no face Arinder had ever seen before. Just a folder, a threat, and a deadline. The folder contained photographs, documents, financial records with Kedrick's name at the top. And tucked inside the back cover, a single photograph of Niel, taken outside a building Arinder had never told anyone about. The message was simple. Walk away from Kedrick Voss. Permanently. Quietly. No explanation. Or the people in the folder, the ones whose power connected directly to Kedrick's empire, would use everything in it to dismantle him. Not just financially, personally, completely. And if Arinder refused, Niel wouldn't be safe. That was the part Kedrick had never known. That was the part Arinder had carried alone, through 4 years of distance, for years of watching from the outside, for years of building enough information and enough protection to eventually come back. Not for himself, for Niel. And tonight, when the intelligence confirmed Serilith's plan, when the timeline collapsed to a single evening, Arinder had made one decision. He came anyway, even knowing Kedrick would look at him like this, even knowing the questions he couldn't answer, even knowing that walking into that hall would cost him whatever was left of the distance he'd built between himself and everything he'd walked away from. He came because the alternative was watching Kedrick eat from that plate. And that he could not do. Back in the hall, back in the present, Kedrick was still watching him. "You watched me," Kedrick said. Not a question this time, just the slow understanding of it settling in his chest. "All this time, you watched and said nothing." Arinder nodded once. Kedrick exhaled. Long, controlled. "And Niel." The name came out careful, like he was handling something he didn't fully understand yet. Arinder looked at the boy. The boy looked at the floor. Neither of them spoke. And Kedrick, who had built an empire on reading rooms and reading people, felt the answer begin to take shape in the part of his mind he had spent 4 years trying to shut down. He wasn't ready for it yet, but it was already there. "Tell me who he is." Kedrick said it the way he said most things that mattered. Direct. No extra words around it. Arinder looked at him, then at Niel, then back. "Not here," Arinder said. "Yes, here." Kedrick didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We're done doing things on your timeline. Done doing things in your way. Whatever you've been protecting, whoever you've been protecting. I deserve to know it. Now." Arinder was quiet for 2 full seconds. Then he crouched down to Niel's level, the same way Kedrick had earlier, and said something low that the room couldn't hear. The boy nodded slowly. His eyes moved to Kedrick once. Then he sat back in the chair and folded his hands in his lap. Patient. Quiet. Arinder stood. "He's mine," he said. "He's been mine since the beginning. I raised him. I kept him hidden. I kept him safe." Kedrick processed that. "And his father?" Silence. Heavy. Total. Kedrick took 1 step forward. "Arinder. The night I left," Arinder said carefully, "I wasn't only running from a threat. There were things I hadn't told you yet. Things I was still figuring out how to say." "What things?" Arinder looked at him steadily. "Things that would have changed what we were." The room was so quiet now that the distant sound of traffic below the building was the only thing filling it. Kedrick stood very still. Niel stepped off the chair, quietly without being asked, and crossed the floor. He stopped directly in front of Kedrick and looked up at him with those eyes. White, dark, completely unafraid. And up close, this close, the familiarity of them hit Kedrick like a door swinging open. He had seen those eyes every morning for the first 32 years of his life. In the mirror, the realization didn't come all at once. Came in pieces. Slow. Irreversible. He looked at Arinder. Arinder didn't look away. And suddenly, the disappearance, the silence, the 4 years, the threats, all of it, started rearranging itself into a shape Kedrick had never considered. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "How long were you going to wait to tell me?" Arinder's eyes went wet at the edges. He didn't answer, because there was no good answer to that question. And they both knew it. The building had gone quiet. Security had handled the last of the guests. Serilith was in a separate room, under watch, no longer smiling. The chandeliers above were still lit, still gold, still completely indifferent to everything that had just happened underneath them. Kedrick stood near the window again. Niel had fallen asleep in the chair. The small body finally running out of tension, curled sideways with one hand tucked under his cheek. Still in that slightly too big black suit. Arinder stood a few feet away. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Kedrick said, "If you had the chance, knowing everything, would you leave again?" He asked it without turning around. Like he wasn't sure he wanted to see the answer on Arinder's face when it came. Arinder looked at the boy sleeping in the chair. He thought about the folder. The photographs. The night that changed every choice he'd made since. "Yes," he said. Kedrick went still. "If it meant he survived," Arinder said quietly. "Yes, I would do it again." Kedrick turned around. He looked at Arinder for a long moment. Not with anger, not with relief. Just looking. Taking in the weight of a man who had made an impossible decision and then carried it alone for 4 years without asking for credit or comfort. "You decided for me," Kedrick said. "You made a choice that was mine to make. And you took it. I know. That's not forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. That mattered. The not asking." Kedrick crossed the space between them. Stopped just short of arm's reach. "You should have told me," he said. "Even if it was dangerous. Even if it cost something. I had a right to know." Arinder nodded. "Yes, you did. And you still didn't." "No." A pause. "I didn't." No defense. No reframe. Just the flat truth of it. Placed between them like an object neither man wanted to pick up. Kedrick looked at Niel. Sleeping, small, safe. Something moved through him that he didn't have a name for yet. "What happens now?" he asked. Arinder followed his gaze to the boy. "I take him home. We go back to where we've been. And you?" He stopped. Exhaled. "You go back to what you were building before tonight. And that's it." Arinder looked at him. "What would you have it be?" Kedrick didn't answer. Because he didn't know. And that, the not knowing, was the most honest thing either of them had said all night. Arinder woke Niel gently. The boy stirred, blinked twice, and sat up without complaint. He looked at Kedrick first. Just a glance, brief and clear, and then reached for Arinder's hand. They walked toward the exit slowly. Kedrick stood in the center of the hall and watched them go. He didn't call out. Didn't move. Just stood there while the distance between them grew. Step by step, quiet footfall by quiet footfall. The same way it had grown 4 years ago. Except this time he understood it. This time he knew the shape of it. That didn't make it easier. That's the part nobody tells you about the truth. You expect it to fix things. You expect the moment of understanding to act like a key. Open the door. Let the light in, make everything make sense. And sometimes it does all of that. And still doesn't change what's broken. Arinder paused at the hall's edge. He didn't turn around. But he stopped. For just a second. Like he was giving Kedrick the space to say something. The space to choose differently, to call them back. To be the one this time who didn't let the silence win. Kedrick opened his mouth. Then closed it. Not because he didn't care. Not because he was cold or proud or too far gone to reach. But because he finally understood why Arinder had been quiet for so long. Some choices don't belong to you alone. Some protections cost the person making them everything. And they make that payment without receipts, without recognition, without a single moment of being told they did the right thing. Arinder had done that. For Niel. For Kedrick. In the only way he knew how. And the least Kedrick could do, the only real thing he had left to offer, was to let him walk out of that room with his decision intact. Arinder and Niel stepped through the door. Closed behind them. Not loudly. Just shut. Kedrick stood alone in the lit hall. The chandeliers hummed above him. The city moved outside the windows. And somewhere in the quiet of that enormous, emptied room, something settled. Not healed, not resolved, just understood. Sometimes, the night seemed to say, the truth doesn't heal what was broken. It just explains why it broke. And Kedrick Voss, billionaire alpha, the most controlled man in any room he entered, stood still in the gold light and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the full weight of what he'd lost and what had been protecting him all along. If the story moved something in you, drop a comment and tell me which moment hit the hardest. Was it the child's voice in that banquet hall, the reveal, or the ending that gave no easy answers? Stories like this one exist because real love, real sacrifice, rarely looks the way we expect it to. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that challenges you, moves you, and reminds you that the most complicated people in your life are often carrying the most. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have a story of your own, someone who protected you in silence, someone who left to keep you safe, leave it in the comments. Your story might be the one that inspires someone else to hold on.